They said I should start looking for a retirement home before the stairs finish the job. And the way my daughter-in-law said it, standing in the very kitchen I had scrubbed 1,000 times with my own hands, made it clear she wasn't joking or worried. She was making an announcement, a gentle decree dressed as concern, and my son only rubbed his jaw and looked at the floor, neither disagreeing nor defending me, which was worse, because silence is sometimes the loudest kind of betrayal. I am 81 now, though I have never liked the way that number sounds in my mouth because it does not feel like the truth of me. But it is the fact of my body, which still climbs those stairs every night to the room where I shared a bed with my husband for 45 years until his lungs gave out, where his scent still lingers in the fabric of the curtains, no matter how many times Carla, that is the daughter-in-law, tells me we should replace them with something lighter, something modern. As if lightness could erase grief or erase the weight of all the years I carried this house on my back. They forget, or maybe they never knew, that this house was not just shelter, but fortress. Not just wood and nails, but the only piece of ground in the world where my name has ever truly meant something. Because in 1972, when Harold and I signed the deed, we had nothing but his paycheck from the factory and my quiet bookkeeping jobs, and every coat of paint on these walls, every squeaky hinge, every rose bush in the garden came from my labor, my stubbornness, my sacrifices. Yet the way they look at me now, they see not the woman who built it, but an intruder overstaying her welcome, a guest who forgot to leave after dinner. And that is how betrayal feels in its purest form. Not always loud, not always violent. Sometimes it is just the soft removal of your name from the story of your own life. It started slowly, almost tenderly, the way weeds creep in before you realize the garden is gone. After Harold passed, my son insisted on staying here for a while with Carla and the children. And I said yes, of course, because that is what mothers do. We open the door and keep it open. We make space, even when our own rooms are already crowded with grief. And at first I thought it was a blessing. The sound of little feet on the stairs, the smell of someone else's cooking, the company in a house that felt cavernous with absence. But it didn't take long for me to understand that they hadn't come just to comfort me. They had come to occupy, to settle, to claim. At first it was small. The photographs of my parents in the hallway taken down because the frames looked outdated. My good china stored in boxes because the children might break it. My seat at the table quietly moved so that Carla's parents could sit closer to the window during Sunday dinners. Then it was larger. The bills arriving in Daniel's name, my son's, not mine. The utilities switched without my permission. The mail redirected. The conversations held in whispers as if I were deaf. As if my hearing had vanished alongside Harold's. Heartbeat. When I asked why the electric company no longer listed me as the account holder, Daniel smiled with the kind of smile that has no warmth in it and said, "It's just easier this way, Mom. Less for you to worry about." And I wanted to believe him. I almost let myself, but deep down I knew that easier rarely means kinder. It just means convenient for someone else. The truth is that grief makes you malleable, like clay that hasn't hardened, and they knew it. They sensed the weakness in me, the hesitation, the way I still set a place at the table for Harold the first month after he died, the way I cried at the sound of our old kettle whistling, and they slid into that space, not with open cruelty, but with efficiency, with planning, with the cold bureaucracy of a family that has decided you are no longer a pillar, but a burden. It is astonishing how invisible you can become in your own house. I would walk into the living room where Carla's friends were gathered, and I could feel their eyes slide over me as if I were part of the furniture, as if the chair I sat in had more presence than I did, and Carla would laugh and say things like, "Oh, she's just resting. Don't mind her." The way you speak about a dog napping in the corner, and I would smile because I was raised to be polite, because silence was easier than conflict. But inside me, there was a storm that had nowhere to go. And storms, when ignored, grow. The cruelest thing was not even their words, though the words cut like glass. It was the small erasures that accumulated until one morning I stood in the kitchen and realized there was nothing left in sight that had been chosen by me. The curtains were new, the plates were new, the chairs were replaced, even the clock on the wall ticked with someone else's taste. Only the stairs remained mine, those steep wooden stairs that Carla claimed would kill me. The stairs I had climbed while pregnant with Daniel, carrying laundry, carrying groceries, carrying my whole damn life on my shoulders, and to hear her say, they were a danger, as if my legs and my lungs and my will were already in the grave, made me want to run up and down them out of spite, just to prove that I still could. I think that is when I first understood that this wasn't about safety. It wasn't about concern. It was about eviction, slow and polite, dressed up in the language of care. They wanted me gone. They wanted this house not as a home for all of us, but as their trophy, their castle, their image. And the tragedy, or perhaps the comedy, is that they thought I wouldn't notice. They thought age had dulled my perception, that grief had erased my spine, that I would nod and shuffle along wherever they herded me. But I have lived through wars, recessions, nights of hunger, mornings of double shifts, and I know what theft looks like, whether it comes with a knife or with a smile. So when Carla said, with her glass of Chardonnay in one hand and her phone glowing in the other, that I should start looking for a retirement home before the stairs finish the job, I felt something inside me harden. Not rage exactly, not yet, but something older, something sharper, like a blade that had been rusting quietly for years and was suddenly pulled from its sheath. I looked at her and I looked at my son, who would not meet my eyes, and I thought, you may believe I am already gone, but you have underestimated the woman who built this house, the woman who still carries the deed in a drawer upstairs, the woman whose blood is in the mortar of these walls. You want me gone. You want me erased. But this is where my story begins again, not with surrender, not with silence, but with the quiet knowledge that you cannot exile a queen from her own kingdom. The day the betrayal ceased to be whispers and hints and became fact was not dramatic in the way stories are told on television. There were no slammed doors or shouted curses, only the flat voice of a stranger reading out the truth that my own blood had tried to bury. And sometimes that is worse, because rage at least acknowledges you. But bureaucracy reduces you to a line on a page. It began with a letter I was not supposed to see, a thick white envelope addressed to my son that arrived in the afternoon post and which Carla had tossed casually onto the counter, not realizing I was the one who usually collected the mail. And, though I am not in the habit of prying, there are moments when something inside you whispers, "Look," and if you do not obey that whisper, you spend the rest of your life regretting it. The envelope contained correspondence from a financial advisor, neat lines of type explaining the progress of a property transfer, My house, my roof, my stairs, my garden, spoken of as though it were a commodity like a used car, something already halfway signed away. And what struck me most was not even the cold language, but the casualness of it. The way my son's name appeared bold, and mine was reduced to a phrase in parentheses, the original owner, as though I were a relic, a formality, a shadow soon to be erased. I stood in the kitchen holding that letter in hands that did not tremble, though perhaps they should have. And when Daniel came in and saw me with it, there was no panic, only irritation, the kind of annoyance you reserve for a child caught snooping in drawers. And he said, "Mom, you weren't supposed to see that yet." Not because it was wrong, not because it was premature, but because the performance of secrecy had failed. I asked him what it meant, though in truth I already knew. And he spoke with that careful, calm tone, the one people use when explaining technology to the elderly, as if clarity might break me. He said it was just estate planning, just a way to keep taxes low, just to make sure everything would be smooth when the time came. And the way he lingered on that phrase, when the time came, made me feel like a corpse already stretched on the bed, upstairs, as if he were rehearsing my funeral before I had even finished my morning tea. Carla appeared in the doorway then, and she had that rehearsed sympathy painted on her face, and she touched my arm lightly, too lightly, the way you touch an object you do not want to dirty your hand, and she said, "We just thought it would be easier for everyone if the house were in Daniel's name. You know, less confusion down the line, no need for you to worry about paperwork." Easier, confusion, paperwork. Such clean words, so devoid of blood, yet underneath them was the truth that they had already decided I was excess inventory in the household they wanted to curate. I did not raise my voice, I did not cry, because I am long past the age of hysterics. But I folded the letter, placed it neatly back in its envelope, and said only, "Thank you for letting me know," and walked upstairs to the bedroom that still smelled faintly of Harold's pipe tobacco. That night, while the rest of the house laughed over some television show, I opened the drawer where the deed lay folded inside a manila envelope, the same deed Harold and I had signed in an office so many decades ago, and I spread it on the bed like scripture, running my finger over my name, my full name, not diminished, not in parentheses, not erased. The betrayal was no longer suspicion. It was fact. Ink on paper that carried the weight of their intent. And once you see betrayal in writing, you cannot unsee it. I remembered all the times my son had leaned on me for money, for support, for childcare. The countless small rescues that mothers perform without ever demanding repayment. And I thought of how easily he had decided to return that love, not with gratitude, but with erasure. It was then that something shifted inside me. Not yet action, not yet revenge, but a sharpening, as though a mirror long fogged by grief had cleared and showed me the outline of who I had been before I was reduced to the role of burden. I realized with cold clarity that the home I had poured my life into was no longer safe, not because of strangers, but because of the people who claimed to love me. And that realization is its own kind of death. The moment you understand that family is not always sanctuary, that sometimes it is the place where the knife is kept sharpest. The catalyst was not the paperwork itself, but the silence that followed, the expectation that I would absorb this knowledge, fold it into myself, and carry on quietly like always. The next morning at breakfast, they behaved as though nothing had been revealed. Carla chatted about organic fruit. Daniel scrolled his phone. The children argued about cartoons. And I sipped my coffee slowly, tasting the bitterness in every swallow, because what none of them noticed was that I was already gone from them, at least in spirit. Betrayal does that. It creates an invisible distance, a canyon across a table. And though I sat there buttering my toast, I knew we were no longer sharing a life, but occupying parallel fictions. Theirs in which I was a harmless grandmother, soon to be relocated. Mine in which I was a woman quietly counting the days until I turned their plan on its head. The betrayal had been confirmed, the curtain pulled back. And if they thought I would retreat into silence, they had forgotten who raised Daniel, who stitched his shirts and balanced his accounts and taught him to speak in full sentences. They had forgotten that the woman they were trying to dismiss had built the very ground they were standing on. That was the moment, silent and unseen, when I ceased to be merely their mother, their mother-in-law, their grandmother, and became something else, something they had not anticipated, the owner who would not be erased. And though they did not know it, the catalyst had already set the rest in motion. They did not throw me out immediately, and that was the cleverness of their cruelty, because outright banishment might have forced me to stand up and fight. But slow, diminishment, carried out with smiles and polite explanations, was harder to resist. It was a suffocation that happened breath by breath, day by day, until you almost forgot you were being smothered at all. After the letter and the revelation, after the evening when Daniel spoke to me as though my house were already his, and Carla smoothed over the silence with her efficient lies about simplification and paperwork, I began to notice that the rhythm of the house was shifting around me, not violently, but with the quiet precision of a stage manager altering the set between acts. And soon I found myself reduced to a role I had not agreed to play. The first changes were domestic and trivial on the surface, but each one carried the same message: you do not belong here. My bedroom upstairs, where Harold and I had spent nearly half a century, was declared too dangerous for me. Not because I had stumbled or fallen, but because Carla declared the stairs unfit for a woman of my age. And though Daniel presented it as concern, I knew the truth was convenience, for a downstairs room would mean less space for me, less presence, less claim. They cleared out the sewing room, a small space I had kept for mending clothes and storing linens, and they told me cheerfully that I could move my things there, as if exile wrapped in a bow were a gift. And I stood in the doorway of that cramped little room, stripped of windows, stripped of memories, and I smiled politely, because at that moment I understood that resistance too early would only reveal my hand. Then came the matter of the bills. For decades I had paid every account on time. I had balanced ledgers with the discipline of a soldier, but suddenly envelopes stopped arriving in my name. And when I asked about them, Daniel said that he had taken care of everything electronically. No need for me to worry. And when I pressed further, Carla interjected with her smooth voice, telling me that in today's world, older people often fell victim to scams and mistakes. So it was better if she and Daniel handled finances. And she said it with such condescension that I nearly laughed, because the only scam being perpetrated was the one in front of me. My own pension was redirected quietly into a joint account I did not recognize, and each month they handed me a small amount of cash folded into an envelope, calling it an allowance, a word that burned because it reduced me to a child again, dependent. incapable, while the money itself was mine, earned through decades of work, of sacrifice, of withholding pleasures I might have claimed but didn't. At dinner parties, I ceased to be introduced as the owner of the house, or even as Daniel's mother. Instead, Carla would wave a hand toward me and say, "This is Mary. She's staying with us for a while," as though I were a distant aunt who had outstayed her welcome or some boarder renting a corner of their generosity. Once, when I tried to correct her, saying lightly that I had in fact been living there for 50 years, the table went silent for a moment before Carla laughed too loudly and said, "She has such a sense of humor." And the others joined in, relieved, because people prefer a joke to an uncomfortable truth. I learned then that invisibility is not sudden, it is incremental. And if you allow it, one day you look in the mirror and realize you have been erased not with violence, but with polite laughter. The children, my grandchildren, absorbed the performance of their parents without knowing it. They stopped running into my room for stories. They stopped sitting beside me at breakfast. They began to look at me as though I were a fixture, like a lamp or a chair, something present, but not alive. Once I overheard the eldest ask, "Why does Grandma still live here if it's not her house?" And Carla answered quickly, "Because she doesn't like change, sweetheart, but we're helping her." And I bit my lip until it nearly bled, because helping was the word she had chosen when in truth what she meant was diminishing, replacing, extracting. Even the garden which had been my refuge was invaded. I had planted every rose bush, every herb, every row of tulips, and I had tended them through droughts and storms. But one Saturday morning, I looked out and saw landscapers tearing them up. Carla supervising, explaining that a minimalist lawn was more appealing for resale value, though no one had yet admitted aloud that resale was their true goal. I went outside, my hands shaking, not with weakness but with fury, and I asked why. And Carla only tilted her head and said, "It's just grass, Mary. Don't get so sentimental." And I realized then that people who do not invest themselves in the soil cannot understand that every petal is a memory, every root a chapter. These were not accidents. These were not coincidences. They were rehearsals for my removal, slow rehearsals that relied on my silence, and for a time I gave them that silence, because silence can be armor if you know how to wear it. But at night, in the small room they had assigned me, I lay awake and planned, not with rage but with precision, because if they thought I was too old to notice, they would be unprepared when the moment came. The first escalation of betrayal was not their attempt to seize my house, that came later in more direct form, but the insidious campaign to convince me that I no longer lived there at all, that I was only borrowing space until I could be gently escorted out. They underestimated me, because though my body is slower and my hair thinner, my mind has never dulled, and if anything, grief had sharpened it, stripped away the illusions, left me with a clarity I had not possessed when Harold was alive. I could see them clearly now, not as family, but as opportunists, and though it broke my heart, it also freed me, because once love is broken, you are no longer bound by its obligations. So I watched, I listened, I endured the little indignities, the brochures for retirement homes left on my nightstand, the whispered conversations about transition plans, the sudden rearrangement of furniture that displaced my favorite chair into the garage as though it were already garbage. And I smiled, because each insult was a stone in the wall I was building inside myself, a wall that would one day hold firm when the final storm came. They thought they were pushing me into invisibility, but what they were doing was forging my resolve. And though the first escalation was quiet, its silence was deceptive. Because beneath that silence, something was gathering, something they would never see coming. The shift did not come with thunder or confrontation. It came quietly, like a door I had never noticed before, suddenly creaking open. And once I saw it, I could not unsee it. And once I stepped through, I knew there would be no way back. For months, I had lived as though I were a guest in my own house, enduring the patronizing smiles, the allowances folded like alms into envelopes, the way Carla referred to me in front of her friends, as if I were a relic from some other era, rather than the woman who had signed the deed. But beneath that silence, I had been keeping account, not of dollars and cents, but of ownership, of memory, of entitlement that was not sentimental but legal. And the moment came when I decided I would no longer let them write me out of the story. It happened, as so many important moments do, on an ordinary day that would have passed unnoticed by anyone else. Carla was out shopping, Daniel at work, the children at school, and I was left alone in the house as if I were a pet too old to run away. But instead of staying in my cramped little exile of a room, I went upstairs, back to the master bedroom, my bedroom, and I opened the drawer where I kept the deed, the yellowing paper folded into its envelope, still bearing my signature in ink that had not faded as much as I feared, and I laid it out across the bed. The lines were dry, the legal language cold, but my name was there in bold, not parenthetical, not diminished. And seeing it made me feel steadier than I had in years, as if the ground beneath me had reappeared after months of fog. I stared at it for a long time before I did the thing I had been avoiding, which was to pick up the phone and dial the number of a lawyer whose card had been gathering dust in the drawer for a decade. He had once handled a small boundary dispute for Harold and me when a neighbor tried to claim part of our fence line, and I remembered him as patient, thorough, and uninterested in flattery, and that was what I needed. The receptionist was surprised to hear my voice, surprised that I even knew the terminology I used, but within 2 days, I was sitting in an office that smelled of paper and ink, explaining my situation in the careful, measured tones of someone who has rehearsed her words many times. I told him about the transfer documents I had seen, the allowance, the way my son and his wife had shifted utilities and accounts, and he listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, making notes in sharp pen strokes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said simply, "Mrs. Harlow, the property is still yours. They cannot remove you without your consent. They may have intentions, but intentions are not ownership." Those words, as plain as they were, lit something inside me. Because betrayal can make you doubt your own senses, can make you feel foolish for resisting. But here was someone outside, the circle confirming what I already knew deep down. I was not the guest, I was the owner. I walked home from that office taller than I had in years. I did not tell Daniel, I did not tell Carla, because information is power and silence is strategy. And for the first time since Harold's death, I felt not only alive, but awake. I began to study, quietly, discreetly. At the library, I checked out books on property law, on tenants' rights, on elder abuse statutes, and though the librarians looked at me with that soft pity reserved for old women they think are gathering cookbooks, I absorbed the information with the hunger of someone reclaiming lost ground. I began to write everything down in a notebook, every comment Carla made about selling, every envelope of cash, every brochure for retirement homes, every time I was introduced as a visitor, and I dated each entry because memory is fragile, but ink holds. At night, I sat by the window in the little sewing room they had forced upon me, and I made my lists. I listed what was mine by law, what was mine by memory, what could never be taken by decree. And slowly, instead of despair, I began to feel a strange exhilaration, like a woman sharpening a blade she had forgotten was in her kitchen drawer. I thought of Harold, of how he used to say I was the only one in the family who truly understood numbers, who could see the truth behind a ledger, and I imagined him smiling at me now, telling me to trust my instinct, to keep the account balanced. The midpoint of my story was not a battle, not a confrontation, but a decision, the kind you make alone in silence, the kind no one notices until much later when the consequences arrive. I decided I would not leave, not because I was clinging to walls and furniture, but because this house was still mine, legally, emotionally, spiritually, and I would not be erased from it. From that day, my posture changed. When Carla placed brochures for assisted living on my nightstand, I smiled sweetly and tucked them into my drawer, not as temptations, but as evidence. When Daniel sighed about the burden of bills, I nodded and wrote down the date and time, another note in my growing archive. When friends of theirs came for dinner and I was introduced as just visiting, I smiled and asked polite questions, while inside me I was laughing at the performance because I knew the truth, and soon enough they would know that I knew it. The power of the midpoint was not in action, but in clarity, in the shift from victim to strategist. They thought they were slowly removing me, but what they were doing was giving me all the proof I needed to one day remove them instead. That was the turn. That was when silence stopped being the prison they had built for me and became the cover I used for my own preparation. They wanted me gone. They thought I had already surrendered. But I had chosen my side, and I was ready to fight in the only way that mattered. Not with shouting, not with tears, but with signatures, with dates, with the law, with the unshakable fact of my name on that deed. And from that moment, every smile I gave them was a mask, every nod a rehearsal, because I was no longer their burden. I was their landlord, though they did not yet know it. They mistook my silence for surrender, and that was their mistake. Because a woman who appears compliant is sometimes just waiting for her moment, though of course they could not imagine that I was planning anything at all, since in their minds age erases not only strength but cunning. And so they went on tightening the screws of their plan with the careless confidence of people who believe the game is already won. It began with what they called good news. Daniel coming into my room one evening with a smile stretched so tightly across his face it looked painful, telling me that he and Carla had found the perfect place for me. Not far away, he said, with cheerful brightness, a facility that offered community activities, attentive staff, and a private suite where I could live independently, but with help at hand. And he handed me a glossy brochure with pictures of women my age laughing over knitting, circles and men with white hair playing chess under bright fluorescent lights. Carla hovered in the doorway, pretending to tidy a stack of mail. But I could see her eyes watching me for reaction, and I smiled at them both and said it looked lovely, though inside I was cold steel, because this was the confirmation of everything I had anticipated. They had moved from whispers and brochures to arrangements, from hints to declarations. The following days unfolded like a performance whose script I already knew. Carla left the brochure on my pillow, then on the breakfast table, then beside the kettle, each time remarking lightly how the place had excellent reviews, how the food was apparently delicious, how her friend's mother had flourished there. Daniel began speaking as though the decision had already been made, telling his children that Grandma would soon have a new home with people her own age, telling me that he had already spoken with the director and placed a deposit for my room. Non-refundable, of course, so that it would be ready for me within the month. They spoke of movers as though they had already been hired, of packing boxes as though they were on their way, of my departure as though it were not a choice but a date in a calendar. Every word was an attempt to push me further into the corner, to strip me of even the illusion of control. And perhaps they thought that if they pressed hard enough, I would simply crumble, as so many do when surrounded on all sides by authority, spoken with confidence. But what they did not know was that I had already armed myself, not with weapons, but with documents, with knowledge, with counsel. And so I let them speak. I let them plan. I let them outline my supposed future, while I sat quietly with folded hands, because the more they spoke, the more proof I gathered, the more evidence I accumulated of coercion, of pressure, of manipulation. I wrote down each statement, each date, each time Carla referred to the house as theirs, each time Daniel mentioned that my furniture would be placed in storage, each time they hinted at the convenience of selling the property once I was settled in, my so-called suite. I collected their words like stones, heavy and undeniable, and I placed them in my notebook, not to throw yet, but to have ready when the time came. The escalation was not only verbal, but physical. One morning, I came into the kitchen and found half my belongings already packed into boxes, my photo albums, my linens, the small china figurines Harold had bought me one by one over the years, and when I demanded to know why, Carla smiled her rehearsed smile and said she was only helping me get a head start, that packing early would save me stress later, and Daniel chimed in with his bland reassurance that change was always easier when handled gradually. I stood there, looking at my life reduced to cardboard, and I felt my throat tighten. Not with tears, but with resolve. Because in that moment, I understood just how little they thought of me, how little they believed in my right to choose, and the insult was so sharp that it no longer hurt. It only solidified my certainty. They tried psychological pressure, too. Daniel began visiting me at night, sitting on the edge of my bed like a son comforting an ailing parent, telling me that I deserved rest, that I had carried the family long enough, that now it was time to let go. And though his words were sweet, beneath them was the sour taste of manipulation, because he was not offering me freedom, but exile, and he wanted me to believe it was kindness. Carla's tactics were different. She dropped comments like pebbles in a pond, rippling through the household, saying that the children needed more space, that the market was hot and the house could fetch a fortune, that it was selfish for anyone to cling to property when it could be used to build the future of the younger generation. Selfish, that was her word, spoken casually as though it were not a knife, but it cut all the same. The culmination of this pressure came one Sunday afternoon when they gathered me in the living room, the entire family assembled as though for an intervention, and Daniel announced that the moving date had been set. 2 weeks from that day, movers booked, the suite prepared, everything arranged, and all that was left was for me to agree. The children sat awkwardly on the couch, sensing tension, but not understanding it. Carla stood with her arms crossed, radiating satisfaction. And Daniel looked at me with a softness that was not love, but pity. The kind of pity reserved for someone too weak to know what is best for herself. I looked around that room, at the faces of the people who shared my blood but not my loyalty, and I felt a strange calm descend on me, a calm born of certainty, because I knew that their escalation had forced my hand, had pushed me from planning into action. That night, after they had gone to bed, I went upstairs, not to the sewing room where they had exiled me, but to my true bedroom, the master bedroom, with the heavy curtains and the memories. And I sat at Harold's old desk and wrote a letter to my lawyer, detailing everything that had happened, every attempt to displace me, every insult disguised as concern, every box packed against my will, and I asked him to proceed with the papers we had discussed, the ones that would not only assert my ownership, but also protect me from harassment. I sealed the letter, placed it in an envelope, and the next morning I walked to the mailbox and sent it. My hands did not tremble. My heart did not pound. I felt only the satisfaction of a decision finally acted upon. The escalation had tested me, but it had also clarified me. I was no longer simply holding evidence, I was now wielding it. And though they did not yet know it, the tide had already turned. They believed they had cornered me, that they had forced me into submission. But what they had done was drive me into the certainty of my own power. And once a woman remembers her power, she does not give it back. I let them continue their plans. I let them pack. I let them speak of dates and deposits, because I knew that soon enough the words they spoke so confidently would collapse under the weight of the law, under the truth of the deed, under the undeniable fact that the house was mine, and no amount of brochures or pity or boxes could change that. The second escalation was their attempt to finish me. But what they had done was sharpen me instead, and I was ready, more ready than they could ever have imagined. The moment of reckoning did not arrive with shouts or slammed doors, but with papers, signatures, and silence, which is how true battles are won when you are too old for swords, but not too old for strategy. They had been circling me for months, tightening the noose of their plan, packing my belongings, setting dates, paying deposits, speaking of my departure as if it were already in the past. But all the while, I had been preparing in the shadows of their certainty, gathering proof, consulting counsel, and laying a foundation they could not see. When the day came, it was not me who trembled, it was them, because betrayal can be ignored in whispers, but not when written in ink and delivered by hand. It was a Monday morning, gray and damp, the kind of morning where the air feels heavy with possibility. And Daniel and Carla had left early to meet with the director of that retirement home they were so eager to deposit me in, leaving me alone in the house they believed was already theirs. At 10 o'clock sharp, the property manager I had hired with my lawyer's help arrived, a brisk woman with steel gray hair and a folder thick with documents, and together we walked through each room, taking photographs, making notes, documenting everything. By noon, the locksmith was there, changing every lock in the house, upstairs and down, while I sat calmly in the kitchen drinking tea, the sound of drills and hammers echoing through the walls like the music of reclamation. For the first time in months, I breathed deeply, because for the first time in months, the house was once again under my control. By the afternoon, the notices were taped to the doors. Official eviction papers addressed to Daniel and Carla, not as beloved family, not even as tenants, but as occupants with no legal claim, instructed to vacate the premises within 30 days or face removal by the sheriff. The language was cold, the ink impersonal, but beneath those words was my heartbeat, steady and unshaken, because this was not revenge, it was restoration. My lawyer had assured me everything was airtight, that no court could dispute it, that the deed bearing my name was the final word, and I believed him. But more importantly, I believed myself. When Daniel and Carla returned that evening, they walked into a different house than the one they had left that morning. They found the locks changed, the notices posted, and me sitting in the living room chair that had been banished to the garage, now returned to its rightful place. And when Daniel asked what this meant, his voice sharp with disbelief, I handed him his copy of the eviction papers. He read them quickly, his face shifting from confusion to anger to something softer, something close to fear. And when he looked up at me, he was not seeing his fragile old mother anymore. He was seeing the owner, the woman with the law on her side. Carla snatched the paper from his hands, scanning it with her lawyer's daughter eyes. And for the first time since she entered my house, she had no smile ready, no soft lie to cover the truth, because the truth was undeniable. They owed rent to me, now, not respect, not kindness, but dollars, each month, like any other tenant. Daniel tried to protest, raising his voice, demanding to know why I would do such a thing, accusing me of betrayal, of humiliation, as though betrayal were not the very currency he had been trading in for months. And I let him speak. I let his anger wash over me like rain on stone, because none of it could change the fact that he was no longer in control. Carla tried a different tactic, lowering her voice, speaking gently, asking me to reconsider, saying that this was a family matter that did not need to involve courts and managers and strangers. But I only shook my head, because family had been the excuse they used to diminish me, and now family had no authority here. I told them plainly, with a calmness that surprised even me, that they were free to stay if they wished. But from that day forward, they would do so as tenants, paying rent on the first of the month, obeying the rules of the lease, acknowledging in writing that the house was mine. The silence that followed was the purest victory I have ever known. They could not argue with the deed. They could not erase the signatures. They could not undo the locks already changed. They could only stare at me, stunned, as though the woman they had underestimated had transformed before their eyes, and in truth she had. I was no longer the quiet mother sipping coffee at the corner of the table, no longer the guest in my own home, no longer the shadow waiting to be erased. I was the landlord, the authority, the owner who had taken back what was hers without raising her voice or shedding a tear. That night, I slept in my true bedroom again, not the cramped sewing room where they had tried to exile me, but the master bedroom with its heavy curtains and its memories. And for the first time since Harold died, I felt him near me, as if he were standing in the doorway, smiling his quiet smile, proud of me. The house was mine again, not only in law but in spirit, and no amount of betrayal could change that. The climax of my story was not a battle won with fury, but with ink, not with noise, but with silence, not with force, but with the undeniable power of truth. They had wanted me gone, but it was they who now lived at my mercy. And I knew with unshakable certainty that the balance of power had shifted forever. In the weeks that followed, the house became quiet again, not the silence of exile or invisibility, but the silence of steadiness, of order restored. And I found myself breathing differently, more deeply, as if the walls themselves had exhaled after holding their breath for too long. Daniel and Carla lingered for a while, circling in uncertainty like tenants who cannot quite accept that the rules apply to them, paying their first month's rent late, leaving the envelope on the kitchen counter as though it were a gift rather than an obligation. But the second month it arrived on time, tucked into my mailbox with my name on the check. And though the numbers were modest compared to what the house could have earned on the open market, the sight of their signatures below mine was a justice no bank account could measure. They avoided me as much as possible, moving in and out of the rooms like ghosts, never quite meeting my eyes, and the children grew quieter around me, perhaps sensing that something profound had shifted, though they could not put words to it. I did not gloat. I did not scold. I did not remind them of the humiliation they had earned, because my victory did not need shouting. It lived in every corner of the house, in every lock changed, in every check written to my name. I reclaimed my routines slowly, not in grand gestures, but in small acts of belonging. I brought my chair back to the window in the living room, placed my photographs on the mantel where they belonged, planted herbs again in the patch of soil that Carla had stripped bare, each sprig of rosemary and thyme, a declaration that this ground would answer to me. I began to cook meals for myself, not the half portions they had suggested I eat, but full dishes, rich with flavor, filling the house with aromas that reminded me of Harold and of the younger version of myself who once ruled this kitchen. For the first time in months, neighbors knocked on my door again, not to ask about Daniel or Carla, but to bring me pies, to sit for tea, to tell me they were glad to see me still here. And in their words, I heard a confirmation of what I had always known. The house had never truly belonged to anyone else. Daniel spoke little to me after that night. He came and went with lowered eyes, his voice stripped of the casual authority he once wielded, and though part of me ached for the son I remembered, the boy who once promised to build me a castle when he grew up, I also knew that this was the cost of betrayal. Love, once fractured in such a way, cannot be restored to its original shape. It can be tolerated, endured, but never mended fully. Carla avoided me almost entirely. Her confidence evaporated, and when she did address me, it was with a politeness so sharp it nearly drew blood. But I no longer cared for her approval or her schemes. They lived under my roof, on my terms, and that was enough. In time, I converted the upstairs into a separate apartment, rented it to a quiet art student who paid her rent faithfully, and filled the space with canvases and laughter that did not sting. Daniel and Carla moved to the downstairs, and the house became divided not only by locks and leases, but by a truth that could never again be denied. I was the owner, and they were the ones who owed. Sometimes I caught Daniel's car idling across the street, as if he wanted to come in and speak to me as a son rather than a tenant. But he never did, and I did not call him inside, because some distances cannot be crossed until a man admits what he has done. Now, when I sit in the living room with a cup of tea and the evening light slants across the floorboards, I feel a peace that is not simple joy, but something deeper, something earned through fire and silence. I am not naive. I know that time will take me eventually, that age is a truth no deed can erase. But I also know that when that day comes, I will not be a woman pushed from her home, erased from her life, forgotten in some sterile suite. I will be a woman who kept what was hers until the very end, who stood her ground with quiet ferocity, who turned the tables on those who underestimated her. If another woman like me were sitting across from me now, her eyes full of fear because her family was trying to erase her, I would tell her this: you are not invisible. You are not powerless. And the papers you signed long ago, the life you built, the ground beneath your feet, still belong to you. Do not let anyone convince you otherwise. They wanted me gone, but I am still here. And every month when their check arrives in the mail, addressed to me, signed in their own hands, I smile and remind myself that sometimes the sweetest revenge is not exile or anger, but simply staying, simply enduring, simply owning what was always yours.